started. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Janie and I'm a staff at Eastwind. A little bit about Eastwind Books before we get started. Eastwind is a local community bookstore located in downtown Berkeley, and we specialize in Asian American and ethnic studies literature. We've been up and running since 1982, and it's always a privilege and joy to have writers and poets and historians come in and do these type of events with us, even during a pandemic. So we're very excited to have Dr. Annie Fukushima here today for the launching of her book, Migrant Crossings, Witnessing Human Trafficking in the U.S. Migrant Crossings has also received the 2020 American Sociological Association Section Award in Asia and Asian American books. So congratulations, Dr. Fukushima, for that really big accomplishment. That book, which we will show later more information on, is also available to purchase at our website at asiabookcenter.com if you're interested. So just to do a quick introduction of our wonderful panelists we have here today. So Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima is assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Division in the School for Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah. Her research covers issues of migration, violence, race, gender, and witnessing, and her expertise is recognized across the U.S. Her scholarly works appear in numerous peer-reviewed journals, and she values practices having implemented community-based research projects and served as an expert witness on human trafficking for immigration, civil, and criminal cases in multiple U.S. states, including California. Carolyn Kim is the managing attorney at Justice at Last, a nonprofit law firm that specializes in legal advocacy for survivors of all forms of human trafficking, located in the Greater Bay Area of Northern California. Her expertise in law and trafficking includes working at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, Bay Area Legal Aid, and Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach. Hediana Utarti joined Asian Women's Shelter in 2000 and is currently its anti-trafficking program coordinator / community advocate. Her position includes managing and developing the program, providing direct services for survivors, and conducting prevention education in various communities. She also had co-facilitated AWS Shelter Support Group for more than 10 years, utilizing art as healing to enhance survivors' stabilization and recovery. Lastly, we have Cindy Liou, who is the State Policy Director at Kids in Need of Defense, a national nonprofit working to provide legal counsel to unaccompanied refugee and immigrant children in the U.S. She provides consulting and training on topics ranging from human trafficking, domestic violence, to best practices on how to collaborate in cross-disciplinary teams to support survivors of violence. And she is also the recipient of the SF Collaborative Against Human Trafficking Modern Day Abolitionist Award for Policy and Advocacy. So we're very excited and honored to have such a great panelist here with us today. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Fukushima to introduce her book, and throughout the conversation, feel free to drop your questions down in the chat box below so we can address it later in the Q&A portion of this event.
Welcome, everyone. First of all, I just want to start with some gratitude. I want to thank B, Harvey, Songvi, Erica, Janie, and Kelly of Eastwind Books at Berkeley for their support, as well as their co-sponsors of Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies Department of UC Berkeley, Kaya Aman at University of Utah, and also my co-panelists here today, Hediana, Cindy, and Carolyn, for joining me. I'm super excited to have these wonderful folks here. And thank you all for joining to hear more about Migrant Crossings, but also to hear from our experts who work every day on issues of different forms of violence in the Bay Area and across different communities as well. Just a little bit about me is that my work, I do value praxis, which is a practice of theory. And so I'm deeply interested in the way that our theory informs community practice. And this was really shaped by my work in Migrant Crossings, was shaped by my own participation in the anti-trafficking movement, in which I've worked at all levels of organizations, from volunteer to case manager to programs coordinator, among other positions. And I have served as an expert witness on human trafficking for a range of courts. And it was important for me when I was in graduate school to not just think about human trafficking as a theory, as an abstraction, and how it impacts migrant communities, but to really understand how the organizations that were working on the ground were supporting the very communities. I continue to collaborate with a range of community organizations to this day. And through these collaborations, I have met wonderful colleagues and have had worked on cases with Cindy, as well as with Hediana, and then have come to know Carolyn through the Freedom Network USA. But a little bit about Migrant Crossings. Migrant Crossings is an invitation for us to engage with a practice of witnessing. Questions that my book answers is: who is seen as trafficked, and how does a trafficked person cross into visibility? To answer these questions, I engage in ethnic studies methodologies of the Berkeley, in which we use the tools that are available to us to answer questions. I also engage in scholarly activist practice, textual analysis, legal analysis, sociolegal analysis, case study analysis, and decolonial and transnational feminist theory. It takes a hemispheric approach in which I'm thinking with migratory communities from Asia Pacific and the Americas relationally as they relate to the United States. But again, it really is a practice of witnessing. And so to begin, I'm going to start with an excerpt of reading of the introduction. So in 2017, I was called upon by local organization in California to examine cases of youth who had been trafficked into the United States. The goal was to examine the cases for human trafficking and provide expert reports to supplement their cases for US citizenship and immigration services and asylum officers. Some of the youth cases went back as far as 2014 and involved children from south of the US border, migrating across the US-Mexican border from countries like Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala, being treated as criminals and therefore deportable. Debate surrounding expedited removal circulated, in spite of story upon story of persecution, violence, and human trafficking. The youth cases spoke to dominant ideologies and misplaced anxiety surrounding the stereotypes of the, quote, hordes, end quote, of migrants entering the United States, in spite of the trends showing that migration from countries like Mexico was at a net zero. As migrant children and their families attempted to enter the United States through the border, policymakers were quick to criminalize the migrants, alleging visa fraud for a trafficking visa. Anti-traffickers and policymakers debated the misperceptions of the visibility of migrant children, exposing the gaps in US immigration policy and practice. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees found that based on 400 interviews, 48% of children crossing the US-Mexican border experienced violence or threats by organized crime groups, and 22% experienced violence in the home or by their caretakers. In spite of the perception of the, quote, illegal migration, end quote, victim witnesses, survivors of border violence from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico told a more complex story. While headlines focused on migrant children who were released to traffickers, others, like Saul from Honduras, illuminated experiences of being trafficked as they made their way to the United States. Saul's story is found in a statement released by the Freedom Network USA in August 2014, a response to the discourse surrounding undocumented children. Saul's story is as follows. Saul grew up in a gang-infested neighborhood in Honduras. For several years, the local gang tried to forcibly recruit Saul. They beat him, threw battery acid on him, and threatened to kill him. One day, when Saul was walking with a female friend, the gang attacked them. Gang members beat Saul and raped his friend. Saul knew that if he did not join the gang, they would kill him. He begged his mother, who was in the United States, to send for him since there was nowhere safe for him in Honduras. When Saul was 15 years old, Saul's mother finally was able to arrange for a man to bring Saul to the United States. However, before reaching the border, Saul was captured and trafficked in Mexico by armed men. His traffickers took him to a hotel room where he was kept for a couple of weeks. His traffickers forced him to carry a backpack with drugs across the border. Threatened with his life, Saul had no choice but to smuggle the backpack across the border for traffickers. And so eventually in this particular story, we learn that Saul meets an organization called Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, in which he receives the support that he needs. So he is seen as a victim of human trafficking. And in the introduction, I think of his story side by side, Rigoberto Valle, who had very similar fact patterns in the media coverage of the story, and yet was not seen as a victim of human trafficking. And so in my book, I'm inviting the reader to enact what I call an unsettled witnessing, which is a witnessing without being settled with what one is seeing, raising questions about normative aspects of events, paying attention to performances in institutions, and examining the politics of representation. And when I'm thinking about witnessing in thinking with the works of Dory Laub and Kathy Caruth, is that when we think about witnessing, it is oftentimes seen as an individual who witnesses their own experience, right? But I'm also thinking with the work of Lily Chuliaraki, who invites us to think about how witnesses also participate in long distance witnessing. And so witnessing is multifaceted, and there are multiple people that are involved in the practice of witnessing that has impacts and implications for migrant communities that experience violence. And that this also happens in the law, but also in the everyday. And so when the book is, as you think with the book, there are a range of different chapters that you're invited to think with, different subjects and content. The introduction does start with theoretical foundations. And then in chapter 1, it opens up with a case example of an American haunting, which frames the theory of an unsettled witnessing through the case example of the ghost case. And then in chapter 2, I offer a tracing of legal events that frame victimhood, criminality, legality, and citizenship. And so here we think through a range of policies such as the Fair Labor Standard Act, the Bracetto Program, the 1910 Mann Act, and a history of US immigration exclusions from 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to more recent trends, to understand the way that trafficking subjects come to be seen as victims or criminals through frames of legality, and where notions of citizenship impact how we see them. And so that is just a quick opening of the book itself. I'm happy to talk during the Q&A through some of the case examples that the book uncovers for the reader. But I do want to invite the panelists who are working day to day on issues of human trafficking to also share with us their expertise. And so now what I'm going to do is turn it over and open it up to the panelists. And so I'm going to do a round robin of questions. So I'll ask a question and then invite a panelist to respond. And then after that, we will open it up to everyone who has joined this call to also then ask questions and participate in the dialogue with us, as I know that there are a ton of experts who are also here on the call with us. And so I'm going to start with the first question, which in my work, I discuss witnessing legal narratives in which I examine examples of Asians and Latinx who are trafficked into sexual economies, servitude, massage parlors, informal economies. What are the current challenges for immigrants who currently navigate social services and legal services after being trafficked? I would like to invite the order of Hediana, Cindy, and Carolyn.
Shall I start? Thank you, Annie, and thank you everyone for having me. First of all, I really like the book, and as a person who left the academy myself, I'm happy that somebody actually is thinking about this, because I have to tell you, a lot of time as social services person, there's a lot of folks that disappear into oblivion, and we don't really know how to talk about this. So this is a very good idea. So when you ask what is our challenges right now, I would say the challenges are very similar with what we have had before, which is fear of law enforcement. But with the newish administration in the White House, the fear of law enforcement is getting greater and greater. And that also trickled down into fear of accessing social services. So we have to work as social services, we have to work harder, especially to the newer immigrant communities, to the new refugee community, to let them know that it is okay to call Asian Women Shelter, And then the second big challenge that me as a case manager have been facing is the fact that all immigration cases now takes 3 times as long. When Cindy and I used to work together, I don't know, a few years ago, and when before you started your graduate school, usually when we apply for T visa, we're looking at 6 to 7 months. Or 8 months, and then we will know by then yes or no and what to do. And there is a benefit, right? Some of you probably know there's a California benefit for folks that's waiting for the T visa. Well, the benefit is only for 8 months. So for organization like Asian Women Shelter, we have to make sure that our clients are not homeless, because the wait is 16 to 18 months. So we are looking at a year of trying to get our clients not homeless, So as a result of it, a lot of our focus now is getting grant for housing, so that people are not sleeping on the street, and then get them ready to work if they actually receive a T visa and work permit. I think I'm gonna stop there for now.
Thanks, Hediana. Should I kind of go on next? So I think that's a really great overall view of the perspective in relation to kind of the delays that we're seeing in being able to get immigration status. And a huge aspect of that and the importance of that is often linked to what people then are qualified for in benefits, particularly as immigrants are shut out of most federal forms of recovery related to what's going on with COVID. For example, being unable to apply for unemployment insurance. While there are a lot of great local responses that have been designed to try to be more inclusive in recovery efforts, they're fairly limited, right? So for one example in California is even creating a COVID recovery fund, knowing that a lot of migrants, say even after being trafficked, or say someone even hasn't been able to get a green card or is naturalized, many of them are essential workers or live in multi-generational units or multi-family units where there are essential workers, where there are exposures and difficulties to access for testing and things of that sort. So there's compounding factor of COVID to layer on top of just the general difficulties that we have already experienced in the past. It's been added to everything. Prior to this, there was also public charge regulations that came down, and they're just, whether or not they actually apply to trafficking survivors or those that we're serving, regardless of the messaging, there has been a massive chilling effect and fear related to that. And other actions in the past where people have just, they're generally fearful of coming forward, whether it's specifically related to enforcement or the idea that if we are able to get any kind of free service, that something like that will preclude us for immigration status or services in the future. So a lot of fear built in on a variety of fronts. Regarding unaccompanied children that we work with, I think the overall issue is that many of our clients who are, so these are children who are usually migrating alone, who are apprehended at some port of entry, and there's some, given this legal determination, there's this kind of idea that that they enter a parallel federal foster care system, but it's really not quite as extensive. So in as much as we have a lot of critique about state-based child welfare systems, most of the children that we work with really do not get a lot of coordinated services post-release. So regardless of whether trafficking is occurring or the forced labor stays in the home country in transit at the border upon release, it's very difficult to coordinate those services, particularly again with COVID, with schools shutting down, with services being closed. And so we're just having difficulty in this access. And we're seeing a similar conversation around with domestic violence survivors, general child abuse concerns, etc. And we all know that when these factors compound, that they again exacerbate and make things difficult for people to be either trafficked or re-exploited or re-abused, or taken advantage, or just simply placed into a very stressful situation as is, period. So that would be my answer overall for that.
Yeah, and so I'd like to just continue that conversation. I think both Hediana and Cindy really pointed out a lot of vulnerabilities that we're seeing throughout, survivors of trafficking coming forward and engaging in these services. And I think, definitely that chilling effect that, Cindy mentioned, preventing people from coming forward. And then Hediana mentioning now, because of the current length of time it's taking to get access to immigration relief for a lot of our migrant survivors, that could be problematic in that it extends this time of vulnerability where they're recognized as a survivor of human trafficking, but aren't given the tools and means to be able to even work or to be able to access a stable life. And then in addition to that, their livelihood, right? And in addition to that, COVID hits and now we are even more vulnerable, right? And so the last piece that I wanted to throw in there is that oftentimes a lot of the survivors that we do work with are foreign national survivors who are going to obtain or requesting these humanitarian relief visas, whether it be the T visa for trafficking survivors or U visa for qualifying crimes. One of the components is cooperation with law enforcement, which also means if that particular criminal case gets picked up and the prosecutor decides to press charges against the trafficker, a requirement to fully cooperate. And what that really means in the courtroom, though, is testifying, right? And we're seeing challenges now with increased risk of COVID, that they are still required to testify. And oftentimes we're seeing courtrooms, as much as they're taking their own precautions right now, still operating in the midst of COVID. And here in California, we are, still in shelter in place. COVID is very high. The numbers are very high. And now we're asking our survivors who have already gone through this process then now to continue to risk themselves, right? And to continue to testify in a jury trial, right? So it's 12 juries, because all criminal trials are jury trials. And so we're bringing from a victim rights standpoint, right? Where they must testify if they are going to receive these types of eligibility, the citizenship, right? Conversation that Dr. Fukushima's book touches upon, where we're putting them in an additional layer of vulnerability for continued risk of participation in the criminal legal system.
Thank you, everyone. That was really important. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to go into the next question, and you've all already started to hint at this about the context of fear around law enforcement and all of that. In my book, I examined a range of laws from the 1862 Coolie Trade Act to anti-immigration laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, labor laws, sexual economies and laws around that, and human trafficking laws, both of present and from 2000 and those that specifically. And so one of the things is that there's a range of laws, though, that cohere to create the conditions in which we start to see who is seen as a victim of trafficking and who is not, and so forth. But one of the questions that I'm thinking about is, how do you think the recent border practices and executive orders under the Trump administration have impacted migrants and immigrant communities? Have they created more opportunities for trafficking? How so? Can you share some specific examples you're seeing with communities that you're working with? And so we'll go in the order of Cindy, Carolyn, and then Hediana.
Boy, I don't even know where to begin. It feels like the minute the administration rolled around, so many new executive orders, policy changes, rules, just everything started to shift. And oftentimes I feel, what month is it? What week is it? And what are just like the new kind of thing that they've dreamed up that we have to respond to this week? So I think overall it's been very systematic in the way that they have kind of tried to narrow in on how to, I think, restrict immigrants and their access to benefits, and kind of this idea of pathway to citizenship that we've been talking about for a long time. And not only for those who we traditionally think are undocumented, but also for those who enter through legal means and other visas, and even those who are here on work visas or have green cards. So there's a variety of functions in everything that's kind of tightening down. Some I think that people have heard about that have made the news, kind of this sense of the Muslim ban, or even just the kind of polarization kind of communities against one another. At the border, in addition to kind of changing practices where they've really kind of locked the border down. So aside from the kind of idea of the physical manifestation of the wall, and kind of using the pretext of saying, well, we need to build a wall actually because it will prevent trafficking, and the binding of women by duct tape across the border, which we're really kind of not sure where this intense imagery is coming from, most certainly not from most of our practices in the way that we know about the work, kind of frankly co-opting a bit of that narrative for these purposes. It's been very difficult to confront, and they're increasingly, with different kinds of policies and rules, prohibiting and unallowing traditional humanitarian options, particularly asylum, which is part of international law, really disallowing that for asylum seekers and refugees. So not even allowing them into the border, and now weaponizing the pandemic with that CDC order to, I think, not allow, I think, anyone in under that pretext, even though they allow travelers generally, but violating the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, for example, which would otherwise, at least at the very minimum, allow for unaccompanied children to be screened, precisely to also protect them from trafficking and other harms, locking them out altogether. Us knowing particularly about certain cases where children are being turned away by themselves in the middle of the night into kind of dangerous parts of town. Does that in and of itself lead to trafficking? I think the answer is no, and it's not to kind of say like that's the only activity that's happening at the border. I think the issue is more when there are areas of unrest and that there are people who are in great need. There will be people who come take advantage of the situation, which could lead again to other vulnerabilities and further trafficking, or again other abuses or harms at the border. So that's been very upsetting and a bit terrifying, and just even the kind of shut off at the border that's happened at this point. Regarding internally, it's thinking again about how to balance that kind of conversation of how we would keep the kids and the children who are in the shelter safe, but also facilitate their fast release to families and reunify them as appropriate. So it's very counter to that image of like kids in cages at the border narrative that's going on. That's a different thing that's going on in family detention. So, all sorts of, I think, things that we are trying to combat on top of, again, just working within the children and the clients who are released in communities on how to support them, again, to ensure that they're receiving as much, not only emotional, but economic support as possible. regardless of age or perceived victimhood. I think that's something that we always forget, that regardless of what we think that has or hasn't been done, people need their way to live in a way that's, you know, dignified and safe for them. And that does mean pure financial and economic support. So I think that's the kind of overall top line issues that we're dealing with right now, are these what we call Title 42 expulsions from accompanied children at the border right now.
Yeah, and to just build off of what Cindy was talking about, in my mind, I think it's the Migrant Crossings is just such a timely book right now. And in the book itself, once you purchase it, you'll be able to read through it and see. But one of these concepts that are discussed are these like types of themes that are played out throughout history, right? And Dr. Fukushima went through and highlighted some of the laws, right? The Cooley Trade Act and all the way through, right, history, and how all of these laws have centralized themes, right? And I think we can, everything that like Cindy mentioned right now can be tied to these themes of illegality, of seeing migrants as this danger perceived, right? And so again, it builds up this complex, like tied into like who can then truly be seen as a victim, right, and who is not. And I think these common themes, unfortunately, that we've, you know, saw at the beginning, like of the history of the United States, we're seeing being the same rhetoric being used today, right? That wall that's being built on the southern border, right? This concept that these now, you know, our immigrant community members who are coming to the United States possess an even greater danger because of COVID, right? I think, you know, if you pull back the rhetoric, the core is still the same, right? This perceiving of immigrants as dangerous, right? And then tiering, like who is considered the ideal victim that deserves citizenship or to be able to remain. And I think, you know, that kind of goes through and is impacting the communities that I serve in two ways. The first way being like this concept of illegality and the fact of how they've crossed into the United States being even more, because of the context in media right now, you see so many things that flash, like illegal immigrant, illegal border crossing, right? So it's really freezing the individuals who have been vulnerable and who have been trafficked to come forward, right, to report these types of things because of this feeling of illegality of themselves. And I can't trust anybody, and if I do come forward, I'll be deported, right? That conversation I think is so strong, and it's taking so much longer for survivors to come forward to be identified. And I think the other side of the coin is the immigrants who are here right now, right? And I think regardless of what status, whether they have, you know, U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents or undocumented, right? Whatever the status, I think that conversation of, you know, that fear is still there, like that, you know, I am, you know, an immigrant, and how am I going to be perceived? Am I going to be able to be given the same rights and be able to be like, you know, treated fairly as the same, even though, like, you know, like let's say I'm a U.S. citizen, but I still have a fear because of the way I look and the skin and my, you know, origin of my family history, right? And I think that is still so deeply enrooted in a lot of the communities and the survivors that I do work with. So it's taking additional time to really, you know, in my line of work, we're trying to figure out at our end, like how to best support our survivors in redefining justice for themselves, right? And so much of that conversation is, well, what is it that you want to do, right? What would it be to truly obtain justice for you? And maybe it is reporting to the police, maybe it is going after criminal prosecution, or it's not. But I think so much of that conversation is so embedded and rooted in fear that it freezes people. So that's kind of what I'm dealing with on my end.
So at I think I'm gonna share with you what I have seen at Asian Women's Shelter, especially you know, around before and during the pandemic. I think what we've been seeing together as a staff is that there's more and more people living in this slippery slope between exploitation and human trafficking. Exploitation itself, as you can imagine, can be anything from working too long, not quite being paid accordingly, and etc. So I will share from 3 communities. I work with the mostly with the Indonesian community, since I speak Indonesian, and I receive more and more calls from the community, people looking for a job, whether or not they have their work permit or the green card. And while they're telling me that, then I ask them, what have you been doing? And I just, realized the enormity of this underground cash industry. I mean, we all know it exists. I just didn't realize how big this gray area, this oblivion that I don't know about is so big. So we also have Arab Women Services, for those of you who haven't heard. So Asian Women Shelter have 2 phone calls for Arabic speaking. And from the Arabic speaking community that we serve, what happened is, like Cindy touched on before, in domestic violence situation, the survivor or the victims, either they don't want to leave because they don't, there's really nowhere to go, or when they left, they actually take very, very risky behavior or situation to survive. And don't forget our LGBT survivors. We have several transgender folks that left the domestic violence situation only to fall into a situation that's very risky, and that's been heartbroken for us. We also work with the Thai community. We work with all communities, but I talk to this particular 3 communities so I can ask for a good example. And one example from the Thai community that I want to share with is this a story of, and this is apparently keep on happening. So there is a woman who is coming on a fiancé visa with invited or sponsored by a spouse that is U.S. citizen. So with her, she brought 2 daughters, and once they got here, rather than sending these 2 daughters who are teenagers to go to school and start living, normally, whatever that means, actually this potential stepfather actually sent them to work in a restaurant and make them pay for their food and rent. And then these 2, and they live in the suburbs of San Francisco. And I think they called a temple late in the evening because they didn't have money at that time because they were not paid. And this potential stepfather didn't allow them to come into the house. So this is not human trafficking as we think about it, but this slippery slope is continuing to happen. Do I have 1 more minute to tell you another story?
Sure, go ahead.
And then another situation is about a monk who was have been practicing as a Buddhist monk for about 20 years, and he has a monk visa, some kind of religious visa in a temple here in San Francisco, and he needed to have it extended because of the slow immigration process. It's been more than 3 months or 4 months, and he doesn't have it. So the temple actually asked him to leave. So he basically become homeless. So he's staying with friends. So what happened was that the friends, because of the situation, he eventually had to disrobe, meaning to, take off his monkness and work in a motel as a janitor and being paid $500, per month, And so you can see, being exploited in every, somebody can be exploited in every steps of just try to survive. So the cases that we hear is like this, and so it's really heartbreaking, and we really try very hard to work with other organizations to provide them with something as small as a Safeway card, or if we could, we actually pay for their rent. But that's the situation that we are right now. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And that's some of the things that I really grappled with in Migrant Crossings was thinking about informal economies, and that, you know, it's not separated from formalized industries. People are surviving in a range of informal and formalized ways. I'm going to ask a final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions and to engage with the panelists and myself. But the final question is that the book is an invitation to enact an unsettled witnessing. And again, that the reminder is of witnessing without being settled with what one is seeing, raising questions about normative aspects of events, and examining the politics of representation regarding legality, citizenship, and victimhood. And so as a final question, what are the actions that you recommend the audience members or viewers of this video do to be more ethical witnesses to migrants who are experiencing violence? And we'll go in the order of Carolyn, Hediana, then Cindy.
Thanks, Annie. And so as I was like reading through this book myself, this was a concept that I was grappling with throughout the entire book, this idea of being an unsettled witness, right? And my role as an attorney, how I'm already limited in what I need to do. And a lot of the ways that I've been, and I have to, for the time being, continue these like colonial and these, you know, anti-immigrant and this perfect victim idea, like these themes, like to a certain degree for me to be able to be effective in being this interpreter and translating my survivor clients' stories to be heard in this way, right? I'm very limited in that role. And so it was something that I continue to like grapple with throughout the book. And I think what I came to the conclusion about doing, right, it is really this concept. In the book, you write that an unsettled witnessing is a commitment to the complex, right? And I think, you know, I am going to recognize my role as and limitations as a lawyer, right? But outside of my limitations as a lawyer, I'm also an activist. I am a community member. I am, you know, and I'm a part of the public, right? And so I guess my ask for anyone who is on this call today is to do that same, right? It's this commitment to the complex, to not stop with just the narratives that are given to you, but take a moment to think about, if this is the victim that I see right now, right? Like, who is not a victim? Who has not been considered? And what are their stories? What are some of the limitations that of the laws that we see right now, right? And to continue to question, to change, to challenge. Mm-hmm. And I think eventually, like, we'll be able to get to a point where we can start as a public, as a community, to continue unraveling the stories, to see and embrace this complexity, to be able to start shedding more light to those invisible and bringing them to be visible, right? To have our laws recognize that our victims can look in various ways, right? Some may have been forced to commit crimes, others not. But really being able to, regardless of the complexities, like to be able to accept that this is a victim and this is someone who should have access to these types of remedies. So I'm going to leave that, you know, that I guess that's my ask, like for people to not be complacent, and that it's okay to continue to ask those questions.
It's me? Okay, so thank you. I really like that. You know, once again, I just want to, you know, say thank you to Annie Fukushima, because, you know, as a person who has been working in this, you know, at Asian Women's Shelter for 20 years, we're always trying to understand or have a language to talk about our clients who refuse to cooperate or meet with the attorney, and they just disappear into oblivion, into this gray area. You know, what do we call them? Are we just gonna, you know, forget about them? So I really like the idea of, you know, unsettling with witnessing, you know, always question what you are seeing. What I want to share with you folks is some thoughts, a couple things, is like about this idea of cheap labor, and that cheap labor is cheap labor because it's cheap. But then I also want to remind you that it is called cheap labor because the human is not seen as human. You know, all the nannies and house cleaner and cook, they should do all kinds of things at home, you know, in our home, but they should disappear. They're nothing. If they can be invisible in our household, that'll be great too. So if we go to Napa, and or you see documentary about the wine industry in Napa, you will hear from these good-looking managers and owners and whoever. And then in the background, you see all these workers that's nameless. They don't have a face. They're just a bunch of human. And who are these people? So I think this is probably a time for us to ask, you know, who are these people? Where do they actually live? Do we ever think about that? You know, there are two fishermen that you know, that we support before that experienced trafficking, and one thing that one of them asked us to do is always ask, if you eat a really good fish, think about, where did this fish actually come from? I mean, do they actually being paid, you know, way in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and what happened to them? And lastly, as a political scientist myself, I always question this citizenship thing. And I'm inviting you all to also ask this question. A lot of these women are, especially I'm talking about the women and also the men, they came from different places in the world. When they came back to their home country and they bring money, they are a hero. They are citizen hero. But many of them come home dead, or they come home pregnant, or they come home hurt, or they come home whatever, with no money or nothing. So they are not the good citizen anymore. They are not a citizen. They are like a traitor. They bring shame to their community. So this, you know, this citizen and traitor is like two sides of the same coin. And I'm inviting all of you, you know, let's not think about in binary that one has, you know, one, you know, if not one, then it's another. It's not like that. Life is just not like that. Just like Carolyn said, you know, the spectrum of exploitation and human trafficking is wide, and let's think about the complexity. Thank you.
Boy, this is a good question, because it does draw upon like one of the basic notions and foundations related to human rights work, however we feel about that, is this concept of witnessing, particularly to record often what is denied in history, right? Like X never occur, this was not a problem. So even the concept using like trials or another system to witness has traditionally been that idea of recording that. And we know that that's not always successful. It doesn't capture like the full story, and it's very specific. So I like the idea of like a more generalized version instead of witnessing kind of even in our own daily lives and practice, the way that Carolyn and Hediana have so like articulated here in such a great fashion. You know, we can't witness what we can't see though. So when there are laws and policies in place that are designed to expel people to the other side of the border, where then it's no longer a problem, or we shouldn't care anymore, that's one of the first issues. So kind of having that expanded notion of who's in our community, but you know, that broader sense of community is going to be really important, because that is what we are seeing is this attempt to construct a new system to continue to other migrants and immigrant people so they're not considered one of us or part of our community, to the point where there are people like me. I was born here in the States, and increasingly getting this feeling of fear and alienation. Like, what if my own community here no longer sees me as part of our community or as a citizen of the United States? This happened not too long ago, but to say that it won't happen again. The COVID-19 has also had kind of the effect of compounding in keeping people at home and keeping people invisible, or necessitating people into these industries, but then we don't want to see them anymore. It's easier to say thanks to the Instacart driver, tip them a large tip on your phone app, and when they come, not look them in the eye and know how they're putting their lives on the line to kind of work and to deliver you the food while we can remain safe at home. So I think continuing to acknowledge that, those kind of vulnerabilities that people are in, particularly during this time, will be very important to kind of have this idea of even witnessing in the first place, much less unsettled witnessing. And isolation and separation from family and support is a common theme, not only in kind of these structures that Annie laid out from immigration law, even in slavery, right, when they would separate family members, but even kind of the experiences of our clients as migrant overseas workers or migrants who come to either reunify with their family and leave other family and communities behind. So needing to be able to kind of reform and reshape those communities and assisting them in doing that is going to be really important for witnessing or bringing them forth. We always talk about like big terms like, oh, trafficking survivors live in the shadows and shadows. It sounds very sinister, but the truth is that, again, these are the economies and the work are rendered invisible to begin with because we don't want to see them, because it is convenient for us not to see them, not because necessarily someone is always hiding them behind the scenes. I think that Carolyn touched a bit upon the law, because oftentimes we get a lot of questions like, what am I supposed to be able to do if I'm not an attorney? And the truth is that some of us do come to the law because we get impatient on the idea of not only witnessing, but to do something. But oftentimes we're forgetting that any action, advocacy that we do has to be rooted into the experiences of real life people, and we have to adapt with the actual needs and their actual desires and wants. And that means constantly checking in to ask the people who are most impacted what would actually be useful to them, rather than our envisioning of what just is, what their needs are. So I think a constant check-in with the groups and people who are on the ground working with the clients, or if not the communities themselves, is very helpful and important. And recognizing that the law is always going to be behind the trends. Like the change really starts with the community. I think Hediana alluded to that, especially as a community member. That is where you're the most powerful, because at the end of the day, by the time some decision crops up at the Supreme Court, or there's some congressional change, especially as things are being politicized, hopefully on the ground. I mean, that's why I really enjoy my current position doing local and state work, is some of the most creative and positive things happening right now are in the local communities. This idea of being able to be creative for once, and during this time of great unrest and uncertainty, using that as an opportunity to dismantle systems that I think that previously, maybe a few years ago, we thought would never happen. And not just dismantling them, but kind of reinvesting back that money into our communities, right, and to these other services. Particularly during COVID, we're going to see massive budget cuts, right? Let's get down to the practical nuts and bolts. In addition to the unsettled witnessing, is we are seeing our service systems getting cut across the board. And if not now, then in the next budget cycles. And a lot of our jobs in the service sectors are going to be on the line, which frankly in some ways shouldn't exist to begin with, because we are filling in as low-wage workers for things that likely the government probably should have supported to begin with for our communities. So being able to say now is not the time for austerity. In the time of these cuts, we have to be able to petition and ask for federal support back down to our local levels for funding. We have to ask our local folks, why are you cutting the services to the communities who have already been hit the worst by this? When we recover, you're never going to be able to recover quite the same way if you're not supporting the most vulnerable people in your community. And those are the areas and intersections in which trafficking is and other forms of abuse, exploitation, or just any kind of backsliding are there to happen. And we have to see this as like a systems-wide change, and not just because we only care about trafficking survivors. So I know that we've heard this quite a bit, voting in everything, not just the federal elections, but down to your school boards. You care about what happens when your kids go to school, or like what's going on in your local community. Every single election kind of matters at this point if you're able to do that. And submitting regulatory comments. So there's other very specific things that you can do, whether you're an attorney or not. Most people don't know that everyone is allowed to submit comments, and the federal government is required to take into account the comments that you submit. That was a really important thing that we saw during the public charge campaign. And again, what Hediana was saying, recognizing right now who are the people in the most vulnerable sectors, it is not a surprise that a lot of them are also the sectors in which we've served trafficking survivors. There have been a lot of articles recently, for example, about how at the Central Valley, for example, and farm workers have been especially hit hard by COVID. And we've served a lot of trafficking survivors in that industry because it is a vulnerable and hidden, invisible industry. We don't know and think about who's cutting the broccoli that shows up on our plate at home. We don't know that most of the meat packers, like a huge percentage of them, are testing positive for COVID, and they have no real chance to kind of like exercise their rights in that workspace and be safe. And so, how can we be surprising that there are going to be further kind of, trafficking scenarios that occur out of those places? So again, urging people to think about that inclusive, broad scope recovery effort to be inclusive of everyone, regardless of status, regardless of age. People don't think that children work, and they do, and of industry. So caregivers, hospital workers, even teachers. Hediana, Carolyn, Annie, and we've worked on all of these trafficking cases in these kind of industries and scenarios. So just thinking through that. So,
well, I want to thank you all for my co-panelists. It's really, truly an honor to have my colleagues share their insights and reflect in relation to my book on their own work. What an honor. And, some of the tensions that, Carolyn, you were talking about that was the whole reason why I wrote the book, because it was grappling also with my own tension of witnessing human trafficking in the community and these appeals to victimhood that we had to do so a person could be seen as human. And so I just want to thank you all for sharing your insights, and also just let the audience know that, anti-trafficking work is deeply connected to a range of issues. It's not just about trafficking. It's about addressing labor violations. It's about addressing our environmental issues, gender-based violence, racism. The list goes on, and that I think that to think about all of these complexities together is important, and that is all a part of the commitments, I think, to address this complex issue. And so I'm going to turn it over now to, I think, is it Janie, are you going to be facilitating the Q&A now? So we're going to open it up, and I'm going to hand it over to Janie.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, we have a few comments going on in the chat box. That's a great question. So the first question is, are any of you able to speak to practical ways to assist someone who in some regards wishes to remain invisible due to safety reasons, etc., to feel seen, known, or cared for?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take the lead on that question. I think that goes core to victim rights that are available for any victims of crime. And when I talk about victim, it's the legal sense, right? We have a legal definition of someone who has been inflicted or caused harm as a result of a crime, right? And so in all 50 states, and on the federal level, there is victim rights that protect victims, especially one of the core fundamental rights is this right to privacy and right to protection, right? And so there are different mechanisms across the, as the person is coming forward to report the crime that has happened, all the way throughout like any criminal actions that are taken. But a lot of the laws that are currently written are, it's the burden is placed on the survivor themselves to have to enact these rights. Victim rights attorneys are very, very few and far in between. They are not like public defenders or prosecutors that are assigned to a criminal case. And so I think the biggest thing in terms of practical ways to assist someone is making sure that they understand that they have the right to privacy and protection, and that they have the right to push and ask if they don't have local legal aid or other types of attorneys in the community that are going to help with the victim rights representation piece of it, to talk to the attorneys that they do have access to, right? If they are working with a prosecutor, whether it's on the federal level or in their state jurisdiction, to ask them, I'm really scared, I want my name to be shielded from the public. Ask questions like that. Ask their immigration attorneys, like, I'm really scared and I do not want my information shared. How can I protect my confidentiality, right? And I think for anyone who is an advocate who works closely with attorneys, I think it is making sure that the attorneys that we work with understand that there are sets of rights, victim rights, that can be enforced to protect privacy. And to, for example, like you can file a motion in a criminal court to have their name be shielded from the public, and they'll be you'll proceed with a pseudonym. So anytime a victim is referenced, they'll be known as Jane Doe or John Doe, right? And so there are things that are in place, but oftentimes the burden is on the survivor themselves to try to get access to that.
Can I just add something? So, feel free to give me a call just to maybe brainstorm on how to best our community's members who are in that situation. I have had a lot of folks calling and just say, oh, la, 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 la. And I said, how can I help you? Oh, nothing, and they just disappear. So one thing that we want to think about is, like Carolyn said, let's talk about what does the survivor or the victim want to do at this point. What are they actually feeling comfortable of doing? And our job is to provide them with the option, and also as important is some sort of a safety planning, because what is safety means to them. So feel free to call Asian Women's Shelter and ask to speak for me if you really want to chat about that. Thank you.
I have a generic response to this. And I think that this is such a great question in the sense of the theme that we've been talking about with witnessing, because, in most of the cases that we saw, people are not being chained to the wall necessarily. I mean, there are cases where there are physical restrictions, but I think the most painful forms of abuse and trafficking were kind of what's kept people in the situation is this very degradation and breakdown of personal dignity and sense of self-worth, right? And, we would see this repeatedly with our clients and manifest in the parts where, like, they would start break down and crying, or the things that were most painful to them. And it would be things like a client who was a domestic worker who was not given sanitary napkins, but 6 rags to use over the course of 10 years, like needlessly. There was a case in the book that Annie talked about where that woman was forced to sleep in the closet of the guest bedroom. That was an empty guest bedroom. Or times when people were not fed something proper, and everybody else got a great meal, but you had to go eat somewhere else out of canned beans, or all the other kids got a nice Christmas gift, but the one kid who joined later had used socks wrapped up as a joke. So this humiliation and this breakdown of sense of self-worth and what you can and can't do and what you're worth, it's a very intentional tactic. And at the end of the day, there is a real risk sometimes in intervening and seeing these kinds of situations unfold between you. And I've seen them, not even related to my case, but just seeing something out there, like some kind of interaction where I felt uncomfortable and unsafe myself knowing how to intervene. Because there is a real risk. There's a real risk of danger to yourself and maybe to that other person on how to handle the scenario. And I think that's what makes it so, scary for us. And it's not always easy to have someone like Hediana or kind of on speed dial to then figure out what to call or what to do. So it just depends on the situation. But overall, I think sometimes it's a look, sometimes it's a comment, sometimes it's an acknowledging of that person's worth or recognition of what's happening to them. And that's not necessarily focusing on the terrible actions of what someone else is doing, but that person themselves is worthwhile of safety or respect or love, or that they are worthwhile of your greeting or acknowledgement. That has oftentimes been that key signal for someone that there are people out there who care or see the situation that's going on or see me. And if and when they're ready to ask for that help to leave a situation, those are the kind of mini steps that may kind of, amount to that. It's kind of a joke. It's not that funny, I guess, but there was one case I'll always remember where a client told us, I knew I was worthwhile to leave the situation I was in because I watched Dr. Phil on TV and he was going through something. I was like, Dr. Phil. I was like, well, I guess whatever it took, like whatever steps it took for you to get those feelings to, you know, feel like that you even deserve to ask for help. I think that that's where a lot of this really, that's where the motion starts for a lot of our cases in the work that we've seen.
I just want to add really quickly is that a lot of survivors of human trafficking are invisible. You know, I think it's the ones that come forward for particular immigration relief needs or other social service needs. And so when I worked in community organizations, I found that, and then when I did needs assessments and as a researcher, I found that oftentimes survivors' needs are very basic. They have housing needs, they have food needs. These are just the needs that we need to be a full human being, and it's through their stories that you learn that they're trafficking, but then maybe they're coming forward because they have other specific needs that need to be taken care of. And so many people survive a range of violence and have that violence invisible, right, for a range of reasons, stigma, fear, and so forth. You know, I think the mechanisms of the T visa and U visa allow people to come forward so they can have the relief that they need. But what we heard in the beginning is that it's still not enough, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they've been systematically rendered invisible, and they've been pushed away or not helped by other people or other systems, like time and again, possibly in the past. And so it is also built upon of that degradation of, you know, your humanity or what, you know, or your ability to seek help, etc., that people have often experienced.
Great, thank you. And I also see a lot of people sharing links in the chat box, so don't worry, we will take note of those links and send them out as a follow-up email for your reference. We have another question. So many anti-trafficking agencies are faith-based or focused on survivors who experience domestic minor sex trafficking. Do you see this influencing the accessibility of services to survivors of labor and sex trafficking who are immigrants?
Thank you for the question. And I have to say that we are lucky here in the Bay Area that there are a lot of services. So, you know, I think each organization is trying to outreach to, you know, different population appropriate, you know, to their mission and vision. I would say for labor and sex trafficking who are international, the barrier is actually language and cultural support. So first of all, you know, just to reaffirm what Annie said earlier, a lot of folks who call us, they come out not as a survivor of trafficking. People don't call crisis line of Asian Women Shelter and say, hi, I'm Annie, I am a trafficking victim. No, they call us and say, I live and work at the same place. I haven't been paid for 3 months, and the owner of the restaurant trying to rape me. Please find, can I go to your shelter? You know, so it's like a domestic violence, sexual assault, not being paid. There's all kinds of things, one after the other. So it is actually our job to actually assess what is, you know, what's happening. And so when somebody call and they have a language access issue, or they speak very little English, then it becomes even harder to access support, and fear on top of it. And what usually happens is folks talk to each other, and then eventually somebody from the community speak to us. So I would say, you know, the barrier is cultural, knowledge, and also language. And I can say that when folks know that there are Thai-speaking staff or interpreter at Asian Women Shelter, and the temples know about it, more Thai-speaking folks come forward. You know, so if you ask, somebody will ask at Asian Women Shelter, what are your statistics? Are they mostly Chinese? Are they mostly whatever Cambodian? No, we cannot say that. When we don't have a Cambodian-speaking person or staff in the organization, then there's no Cambodian, you know, survivors come forward to call us. just to give you a perspective of what we're doing every day. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this question is interesting because it ties in with a lot of, again, the themes in the book, right? Like if one organization that's faith-based is only looking at sex trafficking of minors, then that's all they're going to see, right? So that means that their lens is focused on one particular population group. And I mean, if that's what they're choosing and how they are going to design their capacity, that's one thing. But the reality is that it could be a spectrum, right? And oftentimes survivors can experience multiple forms of not only abuse in general, but of trafficking. So you can easily have someone who is labor trafficked who is also later on sex trafficked, or vice versa. And I think by limiting the focus down to like, we're only going to serve, or we're only going to learn about this one particular group, I think then it pushes more of the others into this, you know, as Hediana has been referring to this oblivion, right? This invisibility, right? And so this is a constant conversation that we're seeing across the board, not only with faith-based organizations, but across the board, right? What about minors who have been labor trafficked, right? Mm-hmm. Where do they go? How do they get, like, you know, services? How do they get identified? When, you know, and so I think that kind of raises the questions. So in terms of accessibility, I think it then, it falls on other, like, if it's not that faith-based organization, then the burden falls on someone somewhere along the line, another service provider who is broadly looking at all forms of trafficking then to identify, or some advocate who has gone to a training to learn about labor trafficking to then identify, right? So I do think in the sense, in terms of access, it does limit if organizations are only looking at one, right? And that's why at Justice at Last, it's really important for us to point out that we serve all survivors, right? All forms of trafficking. And we really do believe it's okay to hone in and only, you know, serve one certain type. But the reality is you should be, you know, doing intakes and screening for all, right? And if you can't do it in-house, then you can at least identify, bring this person to visibility, and then connect them with services, with other organizations that do the work.
I'm going to answer this question also, seeing that there was also a comment about then what would you see as faith-based communities, like how can they also then be uniquely situated to help witness things as well? So, I mean, the reason this question is so complex, and I appreciate it, is that there's differing forms of faith-based communities, right, and the way that they're organized. And so that's manifested also really different in the way that in our service work, we've also collaborated or worked with them or kind of interacted with faith-based communities. So in some places, the faith-based communities have been the main sources of actual cultural and language support, like Hediana has mentioned. And sometimes that's great, but it can also be very stressful because it's a very small insert community, but kind of everyone knows each other's business, or there might be people who are seen as pillars of kind of like, pillars in the community who are also involved in that faith-based community. So it's an interesting and complicated like interaction then that you might have with them, with like a local gurdwara. And we've had, again, these experiences not only in anti-trafficking work, but domestic violence issues and sexual assault, et cetera, the sort, how to interact. And faith-based communities can create strong notions of community and belonging, but also of people then who also stand outside of that community, right? And what that extension means. So whether or not you're a trafficking survivor who might fit into that community as opposed to someone who doesn't fit into that community and it's more obvious, those interactions also have been very different for us because we often see the most support, but also the most potential for re-exploitation and shame coming forth from people when they're from their own communities. Oftentimes we see a lot of trafficking happening because people know how to say the right things, push the right cultural buttons of like guilt or shame to kind of psychologically keep people in that situation. So those are all always things that I think we are very cognizant of. The other one, just flat out on a pure service provision level, is the notion of reproductive justice and rights is a very kind of, and divorce. So like some of these have very charged notions within the religious context. you know, those are kind of complicated things, particularly when you're dealing with clients who may have experienced sexual assault or have like notions of needing, or who need to kind of be in a safer space to exercise like pure control over their own bodies, but having this external kind of system managing that. We've, you know, frankly had that happen quite a number of times, even while some of our clients have continued to be sexually active, but are staying with in spaces that are religious spaces that I think aren't accepting of that, and even just that the tension and stress there from on the service level. There's also a tendency sometimes, and again, I don't mean to over broaden this kind of dichotomy, but you know, sometimes there's what appeals, I think, to a lot of faith-based communities or religious groups to this work. There's various things that can attract them. Some of it is seeing yourself in a similar kind of like migrant narrative, but some of it is really this notion of like that gets distilled to good versus evil, salvation or not. That doesn't always fit, I think, into the actual reality of what is going on with an individual's life, and maybe even how they see themselves in that picture. So those have all been, I think, some, I don't want to say complications, but things that we work to collaborate on to kind of figure out how to harness both the like great, awesome strength of the faith-based communities and their work, but you know, balancing with the expectations and needs of people who are looking for this assistance, or maybe not even looking, but are encountering this assistance. You know, in terms of know your rights, there's a lot of great outreach and phenomenal work that has been done though with faith-based communities, particularly about educating and organizing others to show this great show of strength, that regardless of what people think of a certain community being rural or being faith-based, that it is welcoming of immigrants, that it is pro-sanctuary, that it will organize around workers' rights, that it has robust youth-based youth groups. That's been very phenomenal. That's not just pure kind of know your rights specific outreach looking for trafficking survivors, but really to build, again, a really robust community and response that is open and welcome, that really lays that groundwork and change. And to me, that is irreplaceable, and something that me as an individual attorney every day that I'm not necessarily having the power to do. So hope that answers that question, both of those questions.
Sorry, if I can just quickly chime in to the end of that, just tagging on that if you are part of a faith-based community, want to learn more about what's going on, and I do think especially with what we've been talking about with the impacts of COVID, right, and that these support structures, a lot of our immigrant communities will then have to look at informal ways of getting support because they won't be able to formally receive it through public benefits or other types of government institutions. I do think it provides a unique opportunity for faith-based organizations to get informed, to be then create this safe space for vulnerable community members to come forward and receive services. And I do think it's about then how, like, right, if you are a faith-based organization with all this information now, like, you know, I guess my practical ask for you all is to reach out to organizations that are doing the work. AWS is an amazing, Asian Women's Shelter is an amazing advocacy group, wealth of knowledge, who you know, can definitely partner. Justice at Last is the same thing. We really strive in being able to build the capacity of the work that we do by creating a community response to anti-trafficking, right? And so I think it's about contacting your, you know, wherever you are, right? I think there are two groups or two links that we've put in for service providers. I should actually put in also the Freedom Network, right? The Freedom Network is a consortium of human rights-based organizations that really approach this work in anti-trafficking movement to provide services to survivors of human trafficking in a really holistic and responsible way. I would actually start by reaching out to your nearest Freedom Network member, saying, I am a faith-based organization. These are the types of resources that, like, I'd really like to be able to collaborate with you on. So I'm just gonna put that link in the chat, and that's gonna be that's it.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say really quickly about the religion question. I'm not a religious studies scholar, but I do know that the history of the anti-trafficking movement has definitely been impacted by Christianity. That definitely has been a movement that has shaped them. There have been also, I think that there are models of radical roles in which, like when I think about liberation theology, for example, in which they've been, there are models in which we can see opportunities. And then also, I think in the Bay Area, there are interfaith connections and coalitions that are happening and in immigrant communities. And so, I think that we don't want to see it in a binary. It's like religion bad. It has negative consequence for some survivors. We know that some survivors have been impacted and may not like services that are religious. And so then I think having a wealth of resources is important, as my colleagues are pointing out. But we cannot forget that when we move into certain parts of the United States, those options are less. And so like I live in Utah now, and so then there are not the same kind of diversity of resources, both religious diversity of resources in the same way when you have more of a predominant religion that it defines the state of Utah.
Great, awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I see that people are inputting a lot of links and resources. There's a question about asking for a comprehensive list of organizations within the US and California that people can reference to in order to provide support or learn more. I don't know if you guys have any additional organizations that you can think of or anything, but it looks like our program is coming to an end. Thank you so much. Oh,
can
yeah.
sorry, can I just answer one question there, Ginny?
Yes.
There was a question there about whether or not our organization actually doing proactive community education and stuff. Just want to let you know, yes, we do. Justice Atlas, I have worked with Justice Atlas to do a lot of workshops, for the different organization. But what's important for us at Asian Women's Shelter at this point is actually reaching out to the youth communities, the youth group, and then also the new refugees community. There's new Yemeni refugees community that's going on, the Arabic speaking community that has not actually come out very much about this. I have worked with our other friends to work with people with disabilities because they are even more vulnerable to exploitation like this, the LGBT community. So yes, we have been doing a lot of outreach, but it's never enough. So if you are interested, find us, find one of us, and have our attorneys speak to your group. It will be great if you do that. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all, everyone, so much for joining us. There was a comment which I really liked saying thank you to all the panelists. You all truly are modeling the practice of embracing the complexity to truly meet the needs of this work and the needs of survivors. Yeah, so if you enjoyed our chat today, you can visit our website to purchase a copy of Dr. Fukushima's book, which is autographed. I think she sent in an autographed copy, so thank you for that. Yeah, I think thank you again so much for the panelists and everyone sharing your experience and wisdom. I think it's a really valuable conversation, and we will definitely be following up with everything that was posted in the chat. So yeah, thank you to Annie, Carolyn, Hediana, and Cindy, and also the Eastwind team for putting on this event. We have, if Kelly wants to share a slide, just showing that we have the book if you would like to purchase online. Here's where you can purchase the book. Eastwind is doing curbside pickup, and we're also shipping books out. And so we also have more events lined up this month if you want to check it out. But yeah, thank you everyone so much. And we hope that you also support our bookstore with, other purchases and donations as well. Due to COVID, we made the switch to online orders. So we're really depending on these online orders to keep our bookstore up and running and be able to kind of bring all of these wonderful activists and community members into conversation with each other. So yeah, thank you. If I don't know if any of our panelists have any last or closing thoughts that they would like to share.
I just want to thank everyone, and please support our local stores, our local bookstores, and especially Eastwind, amazing resource. So please support local. And I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you everyone for joining with the change. I broke my ankle, still broken, but I am not in the hospital now. So I am so happy to be with you all. So thank you, everyone.
Just want to thank everyone as well. You're here with us on a Sunday afternoon, which means you obviously care massively. It's amazing to me, especially when you've probably been bombarded with like a million webinars and Zoom invites in the last few months. I truly do hope that everyone